I've already commented on that, but essentially, these three men preached their doctrine on a very personal note. My father agreed with a lot of what they said. I don't. Dust storms. Owing to the fact that the Great Plains farmers had overgrazed the land, eventually all the grass in the Great Plains was dried up. Then came a dry spell. The grass was eaten up, and then there was no grass to keep the soil in place, is what I'm trying to say. And the dust began to blow across the country. It was really, really bad in the Great Plains area, but it got bad even in the Far East, all the way to the Atlantic coast. The winds, I mean, if you know anything, because of the rotation of the earth, the winds tend to blow from west to east. And you watch a storm developing, almost all storms develop toward the west and spread east. Some, oftentimes, well, toward the northeast, yeah, I admit it, toward the north and east. But anyway, big dust storms, and the country had no way to deal with them. The people living in a lot of people in the Great Plains choked to death or died from too much dust in their lungs, so their lives were greatly shortened. A lot of them learned to wear handkerchiefs over their faces, which helped, and a lot of them learned to put cotton or rags or whatever they could get on their windows and doors to try to keep the dust out of their home. That worked a little bit. But again, if you burn a fire in a fireplace, even in a stove, in a house that's not ventilated, you run a serious risk of dying from carbon monoxide poisoning. Very, very serious. And carbon monoxide is painless. All of a sudden you find yourself completely helpless, unable to move. And if you're asleep, you'll just simply die in your sleep and never wake up, and they'll find you the following day.
They have the meters in your house now, the smoke detectors, they pick up.
What's that?
They pick up that carbon monoxide in your garage. You have one in your
Yeah,
house.
we have carbon monoxide detectors. I have one in my home.
Yeah.
But in those days, they didn't have them. Again, talking about technology that exists now, but dust storms. Now, into this scenario stepped a man who had a solution to the problem, at least it seemed to, John Maynard Keynes. Now that name is pronounced K, like it's spelled C-A-I-N-E-S, but it actually is spelled K-E-Y-N-S. I mispronounced it for several years myself. But John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes said that the way to get out of depression was that when a depression occurs, governments should lower taxes and spend like crazy, spend on works projects, and spend enough to get them out of depression. Now, folks, you should have picked up on something. How can a government spend a lot of money while lowering taxes? The answer is, it borrows the money. Spends money it doesn't have. So the government should borrow a lot of money and spend it on works projects. Then, here's the good news. Once the depression is over with, the government can pay back what it borrows, and everybody be happy. Now, there's one catch-22 to that. When a depression is over with, the governments never stop spending the money and never collect the money back that they've spent, and the debt keeps going deeper and deeper and deeper. This is what actually has happened in reality. Keynes did not plan on this, did not foresee this. But nevertheless, his idea was that government should spend its way out of depression. Now, folk, one of the history books I taught from here at this school said that a certain country in Europe followed this advice and got out of depression. The country was Germany. In 1936, Germany was out of its depression. All right, I want to ask you, who was in charge of Germany in 1936?
Hitler.
Adolf. Yeah, Saint Adolf. No, don't call him Saint. Adolf Hitler. I mean, he was Man of the Year, Time Magazine, in 1938. His big picture was on the front of Time Magazine, Man of the Year. They did say something, he was a racist. They had that way back in a short article about his racism, anti-Semitism. But on the cover was, this man got Germany out of depression. Germany was worse than the depression we were in. Wasn't it wonderful? Yeah. Now, folk, I get the impression as I read about Roosevelt and the New Deal that President Franklin Roosevelt really did not want to get the country out of the depression. Most of you are too young to know, but I grew up 4 years and 2 months after Roosevelt died, my dad would talk about him, my mother would talk about him, my teachers, most of my teachers, every one of whom was older, both in grade school, high school, and junior high school and college would talk about him. I remember Mrs. Conley. You can't talk about Roosevelt without your blood pressure rising. A lot of persons believe that he wanted to take over as a dictator, like was happening in Europe. Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, Franco of Spain, all these dictatorships took over Europe. But now it was a little bit more difficult in the United States because we had such a tradition of elections and free elections and democracy. But nevertheless, he increased his power more and more, and he would start a program and then abandon it. Start another program and then abandon it. Not all these. Like I say, some of these are still there. The SEC is still here today. Social Security is still here today. The FDIC is still here. The TVA is still here. But now there came some other programs. Well,
They still talk about the 100 days too, still.
they still, yeah, that 100 days is a tradition that's still going on. And every president, they talk about when he first takes office, what will he do in his first 100 days? Because a lot of time, his first 100 days sets the tone on what his whole presidency will be like. And the tradition started with FDR and 100 days. They sometimes call it the presidential honeymoon. A new president has what's called a honeymoon, where everybody welcomes him aboard. Some presidents don't have a honeymoon, but most of them do.
What page is the keynote?
Keynes,
Keynes, or is that Keynes?
Keynes, it's here. I don't recall the page now. Let's see. Fireside Chats is on 627. Banking Reform is 626. CCC is 628. AAA 629. NRA is on 630, which I'll get to in a minute. Keynes, if anybody has, let me see. I know he's in here. K-E-Y, I'm going to look it up. K-E-Y-N-E-S. John Maynard, 613, 614, 642, and 643. Page 613 and 614, 640. So he's not right in this part, but I did put him in my notes now because I knew he was in the book. 2 different places.
Okay.
Yeah, he's there. And again, even though Roosevelt was very much aware of it, Roosevelt never bothered to read his book. All right, I've got to back up a little bit and deal with the personal life of Roosevelt. Roosevelt married a cousin, distant cousin Eleanor, and he was 5th cousins to Theodore, and Theodore Roosevelt gave Eleanor away. Theodore Roosevelt was in the White House at the time. He was the president. Franklin Roosevelt early on had aspirations to be president, and in 1920, when it looked like the Democrats didn't have a chance, that was his chance to take out on a ticket as vice president. Somehow he changed. Well, I'll tell you what I think had to do with his change in Democrat folk. If you ever want to be president, pick the party who's out of office right now, because the party in office is going to fall out of favor due to something that they can't control and can't help, and then you can take advantage of and blame them for the problems and get yourself elected. Now, if I'm wrong, tell me. But this is the way it's done. So basically, his distant cousin Theodore Roosevelt was a Republican. Franklin Roosevelt became a Democrat, and the Democratic Party was not popular. But he guessed that down the road, the Republicans would follow our favor, which they did. So he ran for president in 1920. He ran for vice president in 1920, and he lost badly. But a lot of people saw the way he was energetically campaigning. This man has a bright future ahead of him. Okay, in 1921, he was stricken with polio. That was something that my parents made me afraid of. Every time I get hot, go outside and play hard outside and come in hot. You might get polio, and I would actually have dreams of catching polio. Eventually, polio shot was developed, then Jonas Salk developed a vaccine. But polio was a common issue, and a lot of the kids my age got it, and nobody knows quite why. But we'll talk about how that. But I remember one of the girls at our church developed polio, and she had a somewhat full recovery. Anyway, the case of Roosevelt, it crippled him for life. Another thing that almost destroyed him, and this was kept really secret for a long time, in 1919, before he ran for vice president, he had an affair with the secretary. That was to last till the day that he died. And eventually his wife, Eleanor, approved of the arrangement. But anyway, he, in 1928, he was able to, well enough to run for governor, even though he never could walk again. He could not stand up without the aid of supports. Occasionally he would take a few steps, but they were really slow and he couldn't take very many steps without collapsing. But he had his picture taken in such a way that he was standing on a high chair that made it look like, to a person who didn't know better, that he was standing up.
Oh yeah, you even told last Saturday.
What's that?
You even told it like last Saturday with this presidential election.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, sitting in a wheelchair, but it looked like it was kind of standing up rather than just.
He was, yes, he'd stand on a high wheelchair. And also, he was the first president to appear on television, but one thing that we never saw on television, his Secret Service would have to pick him up like a little child to get him out of a car and to get him back into a car and pick him up and put him on his wheelchair from the car. He could not even get out of the car without a lot of assistance. And again, this would not have looked good at all if it had been seen on television. But he's the only president in history to have been elected 4 times. Now, I used to think when I was a kid, oh, he served 16 years. Wrong, he only served 12 years. He only served a couple of months after being elected the 4th term. And Harry Truman finished out his term. But he served 12 years.
The vice president at the time. So.
Harry Truman was the vice president. Now, he had 3 vice presidents. The first one was a man named Garner. The second one was Wallace, whom people turned against Wallace. Well, yeah. And then the third, his last vice president was Truman.
Yeah.
I'll say this
Wallace,
about
Truman and Garner.
Harry Truman had never met him, and they felt like, well, if he's going to be his Truman, they had to go and meet him. So Harry Truman went in to meet President Roosevelt one day when he was about to run for vice president. Then Harry Truman stepped out of the meeting and turned to one of his top aides and said, to Roosevelt's office, hey, I don't think this man is going to last another 4 years. And the top aide, listen, you keep that to yourself. You don't say a word. You understand? Truman understood. He kept it to himself. Within a few months, he was president of the United States.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right, I'm jumping around in the story a little bit. But, yes. Okay. All right. Now, where was I? Now, Roosevelt's wife was not a passive first lady, Eleanor. She became highly, highly involved, and her mother did not like for this. Eleanor Roosevelt lived a good many years after her husband died. I think she finally died in 1964. But she worked hard to end gender and racial discrimination, and she worked hard to end lynching. But here was the problem, folk. Her husband needed the votes of Southern Democrats in order to keep getting elected. So her husband turned all this stuff over to her, and he would say to the Southern congressman, oh, that's my wife, that's not me. But so she would try to end lynching, eventually with some success, and end racial and sexual discrimination. But and all this stuff was to eventually end. But that was to come later. All right. In 1936, Roosevelt ran for president for a 2nd term. Now, folks, this is going to sound ironic. A certain magazine predicted that Alf Landon would win. Here's the way the magazine took the polls. The magazine people got on the telephone and polled telephone people. All right, that might work today. Here's why it didn't work in 1936. Only the rich people had telephones. So most of the people who had telephones in those days were Landon. Instead, Landon suffered the biggest defeat up to that time. That magazine is no longer in existence. But it's ironic. One magazine based its findings on a poll conducted over the telephone. But Roosevelt won in 1936, and oh man, he thought he was on the top of the world. Now, folk, I want to make a comparison. In 1972, Richard Nixon won by a bigger margin than Roosevelt did in 1936. And in both cases, once they got reelected to a big margin, they both ran into big disasters. Nixon's was so bad it forced him out of office. But Nixon did not get to enjoy his big victory very long. Roosevelt, his big victory almost turned to ashes. Now, some of Roosevelt's New Deal legislation, the NIRA, National Industrial Recovery Act, and NRA, National Relief Act, these two pieces of New Deal legislation were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. This was before Roosevelt had gotten to pick any justice. Now keep in mind, the Supreme Court was controlled at this time by Republicans. The justification the Supreme Court used was this gave the government too much power over what was supposed to be private enterprise.
And the NIRA.
NIRA, National Industrial Recovery Act. And NRA, that's National Relief Act. If any of you find different, you're welcome to correct me.
That was National Recovery Administration.
That's National Recovery Administration? Okay, thank you. National Recovery Administration. National Industrial Recovery, probably that last A is administration also. Okay, A, administration, I'll stand corrected. I should have known this before I came to class. Anyway, they were declared unconstitutional. Now, what you may not realize is, and this is something no president has tried since, Roosevelt decided he would rein in the court because the Constitution never told us how many justices the court should have. Now, in 1869 or thereabouts, 2 vacancies occurred in the court, and the Congress, the Senate would not approve anyone that President Andrew Johnson picked. So the justices went from 9 to 7. Then Grant got to be president. The Supreme Court ruled against Grant. Well, Grant quickly appointed 2 justices on the court in his favor. They got approved, and then Grant got his legislation approved by the court, got the court to reverse itself with 2 justices that he had appointed. So Roosevelt thought, well, hey, I'm going to appoint 7 more justices of the court and see if I can get them through the Senate. That would have made 16 justices, 7 of whom he would have appointed himself, and he would have guaranteed that, well, it didn't work. Both Republicans and Democrats opposed it. They said, hey, our Constitution is based on checks and balances, and I know we don't always agree with what the Supreme Court does and says, but nevertheless, we've got to make sure that no president gets as much power as Roosevelt's trying to grab. He's trying to become a dictator like the dictators across the Atlantic are. Roosevelt found himself terribly embarrassed. His attempt to appoint 7 more justices was blocked by both parties. His own party, the Democrat, and the other party, the Republican. And this was like his first major defeat. In his office. All right. Eventually, though, now in the long run, Roosevelt got to a point. I mean, any man who serves 12 years is going to find vacancies on the court. Roosevelt got to appoint 8 justices of the 9, and these new justices were more liberal, and they began to overturn. And folk, one of the justices, a man named Justice Black, had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, folk, this is known. Also, the first 4 justices he appointed, again, I'm telling facts here, none of them had even an ounce of previous judicial experience. Again, there's nothing in the Constitution that says that he has to appoint from, now President Bush 41 tried that later to appoint a woman who had never been a judge before, and she got slammed. And she finally, but rather than make him unappoint her, she resigned, or refused to have herself considered. But the 4 justices, the first justice Roosevelt appointed, had never been judges before. Basically, he picked his own people who had his own ideals and put them on the court. And got the court on his side, basically. All right. Now, the New Deal did not work, but in 1937, there was a slight economic upturn that was made. A lot of people think the Depression is about to end, but in 1938, we went back deeper into the Depression than before. And again, there's some people call it a depression within a depression, or a depression over top of a depression. Sharp downturn in 1938. At this point, Roosevelt and Congress lost interest in helping the poor, and they began to turn their attention abroad to things that were going on in Europe. Now, there was one, oh yeah, your book is always pointing this out, so I will too. Blacks and American Indians, or Native Americans, call them what you will, hardly benefited from the New Deal at all. The New Deal mostly helped white Americans. Now, folks, this is in your book, so if you don't like what I'm saying, take it up with the authors. I don't always agree with what the book says, but in this case, this is fact, and I have to agree with it. I know this to be pretty much factual. Blacks and Native Americans did not benefit at all from the New Deal. But one other piece of legislation was passed, the Fair Labor Standards Act. For the first time, it set a minimum wage. I think the minimum wage was something like 60 cents an hour, but if any of you know, it set a minimum wage. It outlawed child labor. And it set the minimum wage at which business could employ workers at 18. Now, there are some exceptions, like young kids can work as a golf course caddy, younger, or you might get a job baling hay like I did when I was younger for minimum wage. And that baling hay was tough, hard work because the hay would scratch your skin pretty badly. None of you, I don't think, have any idea what I'm talking about. But, no. Anyway, but young kids could get jobs also at grocery stores. But younger than, generally the minimum age though was 16. But 16, 17 could get jobs at grocery stores. 17-year-olds could be taken in by the military if they had their parents' consent. That is still on the books. But otherwise, you had to be 18 to get a job at most places. And the minimum wage was set. And let's see, something like there was something else. Oh yeah, it limited working hours. Oh yes. In a factory, if they worked you more than 40 hours a week, they had to pay you time and a half. If they worked you more than 12 hours, if they worked you more than 8 hours a day, they had to pay you time and a half. If they worked you more than 12 hours a day, they had to pay you double time. These laws are still on the book. Now, I often, whenever I had a chance, worked double shifts, 16 hours, because the paycheck you took home was really, really good. If you can hold up doing it. Today, I don't think I could, but 25 years ago, that's something else. So, but anyway, and yeah, they had to pay you time and a half for Saturday work, double time for Sunday work. And yes, I worked Sundays all I could because, again, double time. That's good money. And I recall one time, my wife asked me, I said, "Can I take the kids to Whitewater?" I said, "Yeah, go ahead." I was working a lot of stuff. "I can't go with you, but yeah, go ahead." "Oh, could I take the kids to Six Flags today?" I said, yeah, go ahead. I was making the kind of money that could let us afford doing that, so I said, yeah, go ahead. I didn't go with them. But anyway, there were times at Lockheed when there was plenty of overtime and times when there were none. Roosevelt did denounce lynching, but again, as I mentioned, he did not want to alienate Southern Democrats. Well, Roosevelt began to turn his attention more and more to foreign affairs and leave the poor alone. And folk, here's the really, really good news. When the government stopped trying to help the poor in short order, you're listening, the Depression ended. All right, because of the nature of the class we're going to have, the test begins in an hour. Take about 10 minutes to meet